This is 3D Printy. I'm Joe, and these are parts to my treasure chest puzzle box. Let's get to assembling. If you haven't already seen how this puzzle works, check out my previous video. The files to print all these parts are available on Thingiverse, which I've linked in the video description. The first part of this video will cover all the parts and some printing recommendations. If you already have everything printed, or you don't need the printing tips, skip ahead to the timestamp below. The first part we need to cover is the weighted axle. Its blocky shape is an important part of the puzzle mechanism. Because weight is important for this piece, I recommend printing it at a high infill percentage. 30 or 50% should work. The infill type should also be a symmetrical pattern, so we don't have a off-balance weight. It's easiest to print vertically. All other parts that we're going to cover can be printed in a lower infill. 5 or 10% should do it. The next part is this wheel. It's pretty simple, and it can just be printed flat like that. This part is the faceplate. You'll need 2 of them, and they can also be printed flat. These small rivets are an optional but highly recommended part. They serve both as a solution hint, drawing the solver's attention to the portions of the puzzle that move, and they also provide a nice grip. If you go with my recommended configuration, you'll need 6 of these. Printing them with the head down is safest. Even though there's not much surface touching the build plate, the parts are small enough that it should work. By slowing down the print speed, I've successfully printed over 50 of these in one single print. The arch is an easy piece to print, just oriented on its side. This is the core. It's the largest part to print. If printed on its side like this, it has no extreme overhangs. The surface on the side will be visible once assembled, so make sure your build plate is clean and your first layer is flat as you can make it. Textured print surfaces look really nice with this part. This cap fits the open end of the core. Just print it side down. This is the flip lid. It closes the bottom of the core. It's also easiest to print on its side. There are multiple versions of this part available, but I recommend the flip lid container. It has this extra flap to keep contents of the treasure chest in place. There's also a really nice remix of this on Thingiverse by Norbert Falk, which turns the lid into a completely enclosed box. I'll link that below as well. This flip lid cap is designed to slide onto the flip lid. Unless your printer is extremely good with overhangs, it's easier to print it with one side and with a brim. I print these out in batches since they're actually pretty quick. Here's a set printed vertically with the brim. As you can see, they're actually really easy to detach. This is the last print, and potentially a very tricky one. The puzzle has 11 slats that slide onto grooves in the core. I usually print all of the slats at once, pointing straight up. 2 of these slats, the smaller ones, could be printed lying flat, but then the layer line pattern would be inconsistent. Whether you print them all at once, one at a time, or batches of a few at a time, I recommend adding a very big brim and printing very slowly. You can also print this helper part, which you can slide on half of the way through printing to keep the slats from wobbling. There are also some parts that aren't 3D printed. You'll need 2 dowel rods, or preferably smooth metal rods, that are no more than 2.5 millimeters in diameter. One should be about 45 millimeters long, and the other one should be 94.5 millimeters long. Either one can be off by a millimeter or so one way or another, but the closer you match that length, the easier it will be to assemble. The next part is optional, but highly recommended. 12 cylinder magnets that are 3 millimeters in diameter and 3 millimeters tall. While they aren't necessary for the puzzle to work, they help force moving parts into valid positions, and they prevent jams. They also make solving the puzzle feel a little nicer. Finally, you'll want something to put in the puzzle for a prize. Make sure it fits within the flip lid comfortably. Now that we have all the parts, it's time to assemble. First, we're going to add magnets to the slats that have 3mm holes on either end. It's very important that you get the polarity of the magnets correct, or the puzzle won't work. I recommend putting all your magnets in a single cylinder and dispensing only from one end, so you know exactly which orientation you put everything in. Starting with any of the slats with holes, just add a tiny bit of super glue or some sort of adhesive that would be suitable for plastic and metal. Add the smallest of drops, and I'm going to remember to only use this end of this pole when adding magnets, and just insert the magnet in, slide that column off, and set that one aside. Pick up the next one. Don't lose track of which side you're dispensing from. Add a drop of glue. When adding the magnets, make sure that they lay flush with the surface. If they don't, just press fit against something hard, and that should get them all the way in. All the slats now have magnets that are in the same orientation. That's useful for the next step. Find the slat that looks like this. We're going to use it as a tool to insert the remaining magnets into the core and the cap. Make sure that it's easy to slide this piece along the tracks on the top of the core. Place a magnet on top of the existing magnet, and then carefully squeeze a small drop of glue on the end of that magnet. We don't actually want to glue this magnet onto that slat, so be kind of careful with that. Then take the core and note which tracks have holes on the bottom, and we're going to gently slide this piece in so that the magnet fits into one of those holes, and press. It should snap into place, and you should be able to remove the slat, leaving the magnet behind and positioned correctly. If it doesn't lay flat, don't worry about that just yet. We'll correct that as a final step. The important thing is just getting the magnets in and making sure they are the correct orientation. So repeat that with the next two holes in the core. The three magnets are now in the core. Let's take a screwdriver or some sturdy tool to push them all the way in so they rest flush with the surface. Now we're going to do the same thing for this cap piece, except it's going to be a lot easier than the core. Add a drop of glue to the three holes, and then fit the magnet in. Finally, make sure that they rest flat. Magnets have now been added to both the core and the cap. Next, we're going to insert the shorter piece of metal rod into the core. You'll see that the metal rod is a little too long to fit, but that's intentional. We're just going to slot the rod into one of those holes on the side, and then gently pry the core apart so we can wedge the piece in, and then slide it along the side until it fits into the other hole. Like so. The rod should not be so long as to permanently cause the core to be splayed out. If that's the case, remove the rod and trim it down a little bit. It's okay if it has a little bit of side-to-side play. It's not going to hurt anything. It's just important that it can't come out by pulling just on one side or the other. Now we're going to add the slats to the core. Because I printed these with a brim, these slats will actually only slide in one way. I could clean that brim off, but honestly, it does not hurt to leave the brim on and just slide that like so. Finally, we're going to add the riveted slats, the ones that have these holes on the top and the triangle shape. They're the ones with magnets from before. When you slide these in, make sure that it's fairly easy to pull the slat away from the magnets, but that it still has some snapback. If the glue is still not dry, don't assemble these yet. These ones, the brim actually does matter, so if you still have some brim on it, push it in and that should clear the brim off for you automatically. Next, we're going to glue together this Axon wheel. The axle has 3 small divots that guarantee that the wheel will be rotated in the correct orientation. This little lip on the wheel should be pointed away from the axle. This is a potential point of failure, so it's important that this gets a very good glue up. Now slide the wheel onto the axle. It should be a fairly snug fit, and you'll probably get a little bit of glue dripping out on the back, but that will not hurt the mechanism at all. Next, we're going to glue these face plates into both the cap and the core. Let's do the cap first because it's a little bit easier and I want to demonstrate where to put the glue. This is another potential point of failure because when the face plate is attached to the cap, someone may push very hard into this spot and send the face plate in. Unfortunately, this also has a tendency of blocking the puzzle mechanism. So it's very important that this is glued down very well so that someone pushing pretty hard on this faceplate won't cause that jam to happen. I'm going to put a generous amount of glue in the center area across the middle here. I'm also adding glue along the top of the arch here, along the bottom, and along the side here. That gets some pretty good coverage. We're going to put the face plate in, line it up, and snap it in. You might get a little bit of glue squeeze out on this side. If you do, it's good to clean it up now with a damp cloth. Once it cures, that's kind of a little more difficult to get off. Let's just set that aside. And now the core is going to be the same process, but it's a lot trickier. There's not really good access to apply the glue to the core directly, so I apply it to the faceplate and then insert that into the core. The one thing that you need to keep in mind is that if I remove these, one thing to keep in mind is that you may not have direct access to slide this in. You may have to angle it in or slide it around, usually bottom first, and then angle it into place. I'm not going to be able to give you a great camera angle for that, so this is something that I recommend trying to fit first before applying any glue so you get an idea of what the process is. Also keep in mind where you can touch this piece so you don't glue yourself to the piece. Once again, we're applying a very heavy dollop of glue along the center, along the edge here, along the sides and bottom. I'm going to take a finger, kind of poke it into that hole, slide it down into the middle there. I'm actually aligning this on the other side with my hand. It's now aligned and pushing it into place. The newest version of this puzzle doesn't have this vertical line here. Instead, it has an arch, which corresponds with the container on the flip lid. That's kind of a little tricky to work around. So when you apply the faceplate, I slide it above that arch and then angle it around and lay it flat there. We can now put these parts back, which really I shouldn't have added until I had done the faceplate step anyway. Next, we're going to take the longer metal rod and we're going to add it to this axle and wheel assembly. We want this to flow very freely. This is an older axle, so it does not move freely at all. So we are actually going to reject this and use a different axle that I printed before. This is a slightly newer design that's on Thingiverse, which has an oversized bore. So as you can see, it moves very easily. We're going to test placing this into the core. So a little bit of this bar should poke out of the bottom. We're going to do this weight first. So we're angling it into the puzzle like so, and adding that little metal bar into the small hole on the other end. So this is now being held in place by that little hole. We're going to test fit the cap, and the way I do that is I hold the axle in place from the bottom of the puzzle so I can control how it's angled. And I'll take the cap, sort of place it roughly where it needs to be, and note where that axle is and slide the cap onto the core. If everything's assembled correctly, this will still have plenty of free movement even when you press very hardly on the cap and the core. Now that I've verified that this is a good fit, I'm going to go ahead and take that cap back off and we're going to glue it into place. When gluing the cap, make sure that you get plenty of glue down here where we have these slots, as well as along these edges. If you have too much flashing from the brim when you printed these parts, make sure the glue is not just only on the brim, but also on the edges of the core itself. Otherwise, you're going to be able to pull it apart and take the slats with it. Okay, this is now a point of no return, so we need to make sure this gets lined up correctly. Once again, hold the axle so you can control how it's angled. Orient the cap as it's going to fit on. And carefully make sure that the rod correctly fits into the hole in the cap. And that should be good. Once again, this is fitting nicely, and I can test the mechanism at this point. The topmost slat right here should be able to slide back and forth when the chest is upside down. So that looks good. Now we're going to add these rivets. You could glue them in, but honestly, they're a fairly tight fit, and it doesn't hurt anything if they're removed, so I just press fit them in. Also, you can actually orient them one of two ways. These are hexagons, so they could be oriented so the flat side is going left to right, or a point is going left to right. It doesn't really matter, but I use the flat side going left to right because I figure that provides the more comfortable grip. These rivets turned out to be a little tighter than usual, so I'll take some time later to push them all the way in and make sure that they are flush with the side here. Now we're going to slide the flip lid cap onto the flip lid. This was printed with a brim, so it's actually a little easier for me to slide it non-brim side in first. And depending on how easy you want this to be, you can work it back and forth to actually make it a slightly looser. I'm going to keep this one fairly tight. We're going to glue on the arch next. It's important that when gluing this piece, we only glue on these tab areas. We don't want to have any glue here where it would prevent the sliding parts from sliding. We also don't need a whole lot of glue. If this part were to be torn off, it wouldn't break the puzzle. I tend to pull the arch apart a little bit as I'm putting it on, just to make absolutely sure that I don't get any glue where it shouldn't be. All right, we got a little bit of squeeze out here, so we want to remove that now rather than later. It'd be better to do that with cloth, but I didn't have some on hand, so there we go. Now that everything's glued together, it's our last chance to double check and make sure everything's working correctly. When the top slat is unlocked, meaning that the triangle is shown, these two side slats should be able to slide back and forth when they are angled straight up. And the top slat should slide back and forth when the treasure chest is upside down. Make sure you set it in a fully unlocked state so all three triangles are visible, and slide the bottom lid on. You have a 50-50 chance of getting it correct. If it doesn't snap into place, flip the bottom part around and try again. Also, don't forget to add the prize and lock the treasure chest up. So there you have it, a fully assembled treasure chest puzzle box. In the next video, we're going to talk about the design process behind coming up with this puzzle, some of the pitfalls when designing puzzles, and what you can look out for when making your own. We're also going to talk about this big guy. Until next time, thanks for stopping by.